Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, still in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. You no doubt realize by now that great speakers and speeches will remain fully online during the fall semester, so I am preparing a video version of each lecture for the class and making all the lessons available on YouTube. Enjoy the lecture. Our next speech, and the last of the 19th century that we will study, is Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in Franklin County, Virginia in 1856, so that's a mere 5 years before the beginning of the Civil War, and he's emancipated at the end of the war when he moved to West Virginia with his mother to join his father, who had escaped slavery during the war. In West Virginia, he attended school for the first time, but he also spent time working in both a salt furnace and a coal mine, and this was when he was a mere 9 years old. In 1872, he attends the Hampton Institute and then Wayland Seminary. At Hampton Institute, he was influenced greatly by General Samuel Armstrong. Samuel Armstrong was a white general in the Civil War who commanded a black regiment of troops, and after the war committed himself to improving the condition of African Americans, especially in the area of education, and he founded the Hampton Institute. In 1879, Washington was asked to give the commencement address at Hampton, and in 1881, he was appointed the first leader of the new Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, at the age of 25. It was a position that he held for more than 30 years. In 1882, Booker T. Washington married Fanny Smith, but she died only 2 years after they were married. In 1884, he began his active speaking tour to raise support for Tuskegee. His first speech was in Madison, Wisconsin, and he says of this in his Up From Slavery autobiography, "This was, in a sense, the beginning of my public speaking career. The address which I delivered at Madison before the National Education Association gave me a rather wide introduction in the North, and soon after that, opportunities began offering themselves for me to address audiences there." In 1885, he remarried, this time to Olivia Davidson, but she too died a few years later in 1889. And then in 1893, he married for the third time. This time he married Margaret James Murray. She outlived Booker T. Washington and died in 1925. Here he is depicted with his third wife, Margaret, and two of his sons from his previous wives. In 1895, Washington went with a delegation from Georgia and Atlanta to speak before the Appropriations Committee of the United States Congress to gain support for the International Exposition, which was to be held in Atlanta. The Atlanta Exposition, which was something like a World's Fair, was designed to put on display and show the progress of the South since the end of the Civil War. So it's 30 years after the Civil War that the Cotton States and International Exposition is held in Atlanta. In 1895, he also gave the famous Atlanta Exposition Address, which is the subject of our study in this lesson, and it was an address that he gave on the opening day of the exposition. The following year, Booker T. Washington was given an honorary degree from Harvard University, and in 1899, he took his first trip to Europe. In 1901, he wrote his famous autobiography, Up From Slavery, and we'll be looking at a few more passages from that in a moment or two. And that same year, 1901, he had dinner at the White House with President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, this was a public event, and it was considered somewhat scandalous because you had an African American entering into the White House and sitting down at the same dinner table with the President of the United States. And that same year, Washington also received another honorary degree from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. In 1906, he celebrated the silver anniversary of Tuskegee Institute by giving a lecture at Carnegie Hall in New York City, and in 1910, he took a second tour of Europe with his wife, Margaret, and then Booker T. Washington died on the 14th of November, 1915, at Tuskegee Institute. He was 59 years old. So as we look at his famous Atlanta Exposition Address, we want to ask our basic questions about the genre of the speech and the rhetorical situation. With regard to the genre, it's pretty clear this is an epideictic speech. It is meant to be an opening address at a major civic occasion, the opening of the Cotton States and International Exposition. Washington is asked, along with other speakers, to welcome guests to the exposition. Especially as a member of the black race, he is asked to reflect on the progress of his race and of the people of the South in general in the 30 years since the end of the Civil War. Now, as we turn to rhetorical situation, in this particular instance, I'm going to let Booker T. Washington speak about it himself, because he actually writes quite a bit about his situation in Up From Slavery. So let's take a look at what he wrote about the Atlanta Exposition Address. He said in Up From Slavery, "One of the incidents in my life which seems to have excited the greatest amount of interest, and which perhaps went further than anything else in giving me a reputation that in a sense might be called national. I refer to the address which I delivered at the opening of the Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition at Atlanta, Georgia, September 18th, 1895. So one of the things here is, of course, Washington's recognizing the importance of that speech in his own career. And then he says of the situation, "In the discussion from day to day of the various features of this program, the question came up as to the advisability of putting a member of the Negro race on for one of the opening addresses, since the Negroes had been asked to take such a prominent part in the exposition. It was argued further that such recognition would mark the good feeling prevailing between the two races. Of course, there were those who were opposed to any such recognition of the rights of the Negro, but the board of directors, composed of men who represented the best and most progressive element in the South, had their way and voted to invite a black man to speak on the opening day. The next thing was to decide upon the person who was thus to represent the Negro race. After the question had been canvassed for several days, the directors voted unanimously to ask me to deliver one of the opening day addresses, and in a few days after that, I received the official invitation." So here we see Washington reflecting on some of the aspects of his rhetorical situation. And perhaps most interesting is how he understands why he was chosen to give the address. He becomes, in a sense, the voice of all African Americans in America in 1895. And he also recognizes the racial complexity of the choice by the board of directors to make that invitation. So he's obviously entering into a rhetorical situation that is highly sensitive with regard to the relations between blacks and whites in the post-Reconstruction South. He goes on to say, "The receiving of this invitation brought me to a sense of responsibility that it would be hard for anyone not placed in my position to appreciate. What were my feelings when this invitation came to me? I remembered that I had been a slave, that my early years had been spent in the lowest depths of poverty and ignorance, and that I had had little opportunity to prepare me for such a responsibility as this. It was only a few years before that time that any white man in the audience might have claimed me as his slave, and it was easily possible that some of my former owners might be present to hear me speak. I knew, too, that this was the first time in the entire history of the Negro that a member of my race had been asked to speak from the same platform with white Southern men and women on any important national occasion. I was asked now to speak to an audience composed of the wealth and culture of the white South, the representatives of my former masters. I knew, too, that while the greater part of my audience would be composed of Southern people, yet there would be present a large number of Northern whites, as well as a great many men and women of my own race. And so here, among other things, we see Washington reflecting on the complexities of the audience he's about to address. And again, recognizing and acknowledging some of the constraints on him, especially the constraints that are imposed on him as a speaker to a mixed race audience and an audience of geographical diversity, North and South, on an occasion where every word and every action that he took would be understood through the perspective of race relations in the post-Reconstruction South. I was determined, he says, to say nothing that I did not feel from the bottom of my heart to be true and right. When the invitation came to me, there was not one word of intimation as to what I should say or as to what I should omit. In this, I felt that the board of directors had paid a tribute to me. They knew that by one sentence I could have blasted in a large degree the success of the exposition. I was also painfully conscious of the fact that while I must be true to my own race in my utterances, I had it in my power to make such an ill-timed address as would result in preventing any similar invitation being extended to a black man again for years to come. I was equally determined to be true to the North as well as to the best element of the white South in what I had to say. The papers, North and South, had taken up the discussion of my coming speech, and as the time for it drew near, this discussion became more and more widespread. Not a few of the Southern white papers were unfriendly to the idea of my speaking. From my own race, I received many suggestions as to what I ought to say. I prepared myself as best I could for the address, but as the 18th of September drew nearer, the heavier my heart became, and the more I feared that my effort would prove a failure and disappointment. So here again, I think we see especially Booker T. Washington's consciousness of the rhetorical constraints in this very complex situation. He understands who his audience is, he understands what the possibilities are for him to speak, but he also knows what he cannot say, or if he did venture beyond what was considered to be an appropriate or expected text, then he understood what the consequences of that would be both for himself and for African Americans, especially African Americans in the South. So then he talks about leaving for the exposition and about delivering the speech. On the morning of September 17, together with Mrs. Washington and my 3 children, I started for Atlanta. I felt a good deal as I suppose a man feels when he is on his way to the gallows. In passing through the town of Tuskegee, I met a white farmer who lived some distance out in the country. In a jesting manner, this man said, "Washington, you have spoken before the Northern white people, the Negroes in the South, and to us country white people in the South. But Atlanta tomorrow you will have before you the Northern whites, the Southern whites, and the Negroes all together. I am afraid that you have got yourself in a tight place." This farmer diagnosed the situation correctly, but his frank words did not add anything to my comfort. And then he turns to talk about the speech itself. I always make it a rule to make a special preparation for each separate address. No two audiences are exactly alike. It is my aim to reach and talk to the heart of each individual audience, taking it into my confidence very much as I would a person. When I am speaking to an audience, I care little for how what I am saying is going to sound in the newspapers, or to another audience, or to an individual. At the time, the audience before me absorbs all my sympathy, thought, and energy. Early in the morning, a committee called to escort me to the place in the procession which was to march to the exposition grounds. When I entered the audience room, I found it packed with humanity from bottom to top, and there were thousands outside who could not get in. Governor Bullock introduced me with the words, "We have with us today a representative of Negro enterprise and Negro civilization." When I rose to speak, there was considerable cheering, especially from the colored people. As I remember it now, the thing that was uppermost in my mind was the desire to say something that would cement the friendship of the races and bring about hearty cooperation between them. So far as my outward surroundings were concerned, the only thing that I recall distinctly now is that when I got up, I saw thousands of eyes looking intently into my face. And so you can get a palpable sense of the pressure and the stress that Washington faces as he's about to make this remarkable speech. How he felt a great deal of responsibility as a representative of Negro enterprise and Negro civilization as he's introduced, and how he has a keen awareness of the racial sensibilities that exist in 1895 in Atlanta, in Georgia, and throughout the southern states. So let's turn to some of the critical questions we can ask about Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address. In what various ways is the presence of the racial issue evident in the speech? We've certainly seen that in what he writes in Up From Slavery about the preparation for the address, but how does the racial issue emerge in the speech itself? And in a related sense, we could ask, what view of his own race does Washington construct in the speech? That is, if you had to sketch a portrait of the African American person who is characterized in the Washington speech, what would that portrait look like? And then we could ask, how important is capitalist ideology to the success of Washington's address? In what ways does Washington's address participate in a larger American mythology? And so you've seen here I've put the word success in quotation marks. And I've done that on purpose because while Washington considered the speech to be successful, and certainly many people who were present thought he had done what was expected of him, there were other black leaders at the time, and certainly black historians and critics since that time who have been very critical of Washington and his strategic choices, his decision to say certain things and not say other things. And those questions will come out, especially as we look at the Heath article in a few moments. But a couple of other critical questions. Can you explain the metaphor of cast down your bucket? What is the image meant to represent? What does the image imply about Washington's hopes for the future of Southern race relations? So you'll see this is actually an extended metaphor that he uses twice in the speech, once in reference to, or once in speaking to, the black audience, and once in speaking to his white audience. And then we can ask, in a similar way, can you explain the image of the hand and fingers? What does this metaphoric image represent? And how does it construct a view of race relations in the South? So again, this is a pretty prominent and well-known image from the speech. But as you're reading that, ask, what does that particular choice of a metaphoric or figurative image, how does that convey a certain message with regard to what the speaker thinks the relationship between blacks and whites in the South ought to be? So then let's take a look at the Heath essay, this essay by Robert Heath, A Time for Silence, Booker T. Washington in Atlanta. And in this instance, Heath is a rhetorical critic and historian, public address scholar, but he's quite critical of Booker T. Washington. It's important, I think, to note that Heath is writing in the 1970s. He's writing after a period in American history of anti-war and civil rights protests. And I think that influences how he understands what Washington did in 1895. And as we'll read here, we'll see one of the things that he suggests is that if Washington was unwilling to advance a more aggressive claim to civil rights for blacks in the South, if he was unwilling to do that, then he should have not spoken at all. He should have just kept silent. But Heath says, this address, perhaps the most important race statement of the age, contributed significantly to his, that is Washington, becoming the one recognized spokesman of his 10 million fellows and one of the most notable figures in a nation of 70 million. And then Heath goes on to say, there's really two central questions with regard to the Washington speech in Atlanta. The first was whether to speak at the opening ceremonies, and the second was how to speak, to criticize white racial practices and attitudes, or to accommodate to white sentiments, or to avoid the race issue altogether. So Heath has set up this question, and it's one that he attempts to answer in his essay. And as he goes on, he introduces this idea of rhetorical silence as meaningful, and especially rhetorical silence used as a kind of protest strategy. And after talking about the theoretical elements of that, he says, such theory focuses on whether and how members of society should or should not participate in the discussion of crucial issues while attempting to shape public opinion. And so again, we can see that Heath is kind of leading us in the direction to conclude that Washington should not have participated. He should have remained silent unless he was willing to agitate the race question in 1895 in Atlanta. So he says, I will argue that he would have represented his people more effectively by not speaking if he was unwilling to criticize the racial conditions in the South. Under the circumstances, rather than providing accommodation and confirmation, he should have remained silent. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois called the Washington speech in Atlanta the Great Atlanta Compromise. He was another one who was very critical of Booker T. Washington's address. And Heath, I think, is trying to frame the Washington address in a way that would lead us to a similar conclusion as that arrived at by W.E.B. Du Bois. White leaders carefully selected Washington, a black man who would symbolize that Reconstruction was over, and one they could consider an ally against not only the old Yankee enemy, but the Southern populist and labor organizer. Heath is trying to suggest, I think, that Washington is being exploited by the white board of directors, chosen because he was a safe selection. As Heath explains, his presence at the exposition signaled to the races of the South acceptance of post-Reconstruction redemption. Washington agreed to participate at an event where blacks were given a separate but equal exhibition building and were segregated during the opening ceremonies. Viewed perhaps more realistically, his act of participation signaled black inferiority and victory to white Southerners for their policy of racial separation. And this compromise or accommodation comes through, says Heath, in the strategy, in the language that Washington adopts. Washington sought to use white society's values to further the interests of black society. Washington accepted a variety of fundamental social and economic assumptions of his age. He personified the myth of heroic materialism. And here Heath is recognizing another key element in the speech, and that is the underlying ideology, the underlying value system that is evident in the speech, and the way in which Washington perhaps uses that to transcend the racial differences that are obviously part of his rhetorical situation. But Heath remains critical. At a time when lynchings, riots, and disfranchisement laws signaled a stormy era in race relations, accompanied by accelerating trends in economic discrimination and segregation, Washington symbolized racial harmony. And so Heath insists Washington should have remained silent. Had he been silent on the race issue, Washington could have avoided symbolizing racial harmony and left the Southern whites feeling the uncertainty which permeated the period. As Washington's effort illustrates, if one who symbolizes an oppressed group participates in the discussion of social issues without emphasizing people's demands as much as their faults, then silence is rhetorically superior. The hostile and bleak rhetorical atmosphere surrounding the race question in 1895 was not a time for Washington's exposition address. It was a time for silence. So you can determine for yourselves as you read the speech whether you think Heath is correct that Washington was better not to say anything at all, or if you believe whether Washington made a good attempt to respond to a very complex situation, rhetorical situation in Atlanta in 1895. Did he really have the choice to remain silent in the way that Heath maintains? Or could he have realistically agitated the race issue and made a more overt demand for black civil rights in the South in 1895, as W.E.B. Du Bois and others wished he had done? So let's take a look at the text of the Atlanta Exposition Address. So Washington opens the speech by saying, 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise seeking the material, civil, or moral welfare of this section can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success. I but convey to you, Mr. President and Directors, the sentiment of the masses of my race when I say that in no way have the value and manhood of the American Negro been more fittingly and generously recognized than by the managers of this magnificent exposition at every stage of its progress. It is a recognition that will do more to cement the friendship of the two races than any occurrence since the dawn of our freedom. So Washington obviously jumps right into the racial question, which is the predominant question in the South in the 1890s and in his rhetorical situation in Atlanta. But notice here too, and it may be a little bit subtle at the beginning, but we'll see this in other places as well, that he's already adopting this ideology of materialism and capitalism as the kind of transcendent formula to overcome the division between the races. He uses terms like enterprise and material progress. He talks about how the value and manhood of African Americans is recognized principally in the exposition, and the exposition is an exposition of agricultural and industrial production, right? And so he sees this as the way to cement the friendship of the two races. If it can't be accomplished at the basic level of humanity or society, it can at least be found in the common pursuit of economic and industrial progress. And this message is reinforced when Washington introduces this metaphor of cast down your bucket where you are. He tells the story of the ship which is without water, and they get a signal from another ship, cast down your bucket. They think they're in the ocean, but in fact they've already entered into the mouth of the Amazon River. It's fresh water, and so the message comes, cast down your bucket. But then Washington takes that image and applies it first to his fellow African Americans and then to members of his white audience. To those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate the importance of cultivating friendly relations with the Southern white man, who is their next-door neighbor, I would say, Cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded. Cast it down in agriculture, mechanics, in commerce, in domestic service, and in the professions. And in this connection, it is well to bear in mind that whatever other sins the South may be called to bear, when it comes to business pure and simple, it is in the South that the Negro is given a man's chance in the commercial world, and in nothing is this exposition more eloquent than in emphasizing this chance. Our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands, and fail to keep in mind that we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor and put brains and skills into the common occupations of life. Now, of course, when we read this, we want to keep in mind that Booker T. Washington is the founding leader of the Tuskegee Institute, and the Tuskegee Institute was founded initially to be an agricultural and mechanical school, not unlike the Thompson School of Applied Science at the University of New Hampshire. The original University of New Hampshire was the New Hampshire College of Agriculture and the Mechanic Arts, and the Tuskegee Institute was designed in the same way for blacks in the South after the end of slavery. It was designed to teach them agriculture and the trades as a way to encourage economic progress. And this becomes then the language, it becomes the perspective, the ideology that, not surprisingly, Booker T. Washington adopts. But we also see it here as a kind of transcendent strategy. It is a language which is not only that of the African American, but it is shared also by the white man in the South, and it becomes then a common ground where both black and white in the South can contribute to the progress of the Southern states 30 years after the Civil War by this common commitment to a commercial world, to commerce, to business, to agriculture, to the mechanic arts. And this then becomes the way that Washington sees for overcoming racial difference. Then he turns and he says to the white audience to also cast down their bucket where they are. That is, to rely on the help of the black race in leading to Southern progress. And he says to them, while doing this, you can be sure in the future, as in the past, that you and your families will be surrounded by the most patient, faithful, law-abiding, and unresentful people that the world has seen. As we have proved our loyalty to you in the past, nursing your children, watching by the sickbed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them with tear-dimmed eyes to their graves, so in the future, in our humble way, we shall stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach, ready to lay down our lives, if need be, in defense of yours, interlacing our industrial, commercial, civil, and religious life with yours in a way that shall make the interests of both races one. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. And so there's that image of the fingers and the hand, which kind of summarizes Washington's whole approach to the relationship of the races. It's what leads to this charge that he's compromising or accommodating to the segregation philosophy of the South. Purely social matters, blacks and whites can remain separate as the fingers. Yet on the matter of economic progress in business and commerce, right, one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. We see that he doesn't raise at all the issue of civil rights for blacks, and in fact does quite the opposite, implying at least, and in some places almost explicitly acknowledging, that blacks have to be humble, that they have to take an inferior position in service to whites in the South, that he recognizes that there isn't a kind of social equality. For instance, he says blacks will be willing to lay down their lives for whites, but can we imagine that any whites in the South would do the same for blacks? And so here also we can return to that question in our critical questions about the image of the African American person who emerges from Washington's address. Who is it that he understands the black man and the black woman to be in the South in 1895? How should they understand their own role? How should they understand their relationship to the white people with whom they are living? And he continues, he says, nearly 16 millions of hands will aid you in pulling the load upward, or they will pull against you the load downward. We shall constitute 1/3 and more of the ignorance and crime of the South, or 1/3 its intelligence and progress. We shall contribute 1/3 of the business and industrial prosperity of the South, or we shall prove a veritable body of death, stagnating, depressing, retarding every effort to advance the body politic. And he goes on to say, the wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly, and that progress in the enjoyment of all the privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle rather than artificial forcing. No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house. And this last reference, of course, is to the Jim Crow segregation laws that were widespread in southern states by the 1890s. But again, we see Washington diminishing the significance of those kinds of civil rights questions and replacing them in importance with commerce and business. The opportunity to earn $1 is infinitely more important than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house. He refers to the questions of social equality, the agitation of those questions, as extremist folly, and finds the open, widest avenue for progress of African Americans to be in the area of business and commerce. No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. So there are some of the highlights of Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address. And we turn again, as we end here, to his autobiography, Up from Slavery, and what he has to say there about the response and reaction to his speech. He notes that the papers in all parts of the United States published the address in full, and for months afterward there were complimentary editorial references to it. Mr. Clark Howell, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, telegraphed to a New York paper, among other words, the following: I do not exaggerate when I say that Professor Booker T. Washington's address yesterday was one of the most notable speeches, both as to character and as to the warmth of its reception, ever delivered to a Southern audience. The address was a revelation. The whole speech is a platform upon which blacks and whites can stand with full justice to each other. Now, no doubt, Editor Howell is a white man and would have thought the speech was quite positive because it did express that kind of accommodationist or compromise philosophy. It would be something that he would understand as a platform on which blacks and whites can stand together with full justice to each other. Washington goes on to note that the Boston Transcript said editorially, the speech of Booker T. Washington at the Atlanta Exposition this week seems to have dwarfed all other proceedings and the exposition itself. The sensation that it has caused in the press has never been equaled. And we know that Washington's not exaggerating in describing the reaction and response to the speech. Here, for example, in this image is just one of the stories that appeared in the newspaper, this with the headline that Washington was the Moses of the colored race. And as you read through it, you see some of the reaction and the framing of the reception of the address by the white press in America. Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee Institute is the recognized leader. He is the first definite factor in Negro progress to arise since Douglas's time. Something about the man who is destined to hold a prominent place in human affairs. And we see then in the beginning of the story the reference again to Frederick Douglass. Since the death of Fred Douglass, the colored people of America have had no one generally recognized as a type of what the emancipated Negro might become until, at the opening of the Atlanta Exposition, the best speech of the day was made by Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute, a speech which at once caused him to be known to the many as he was already known to the few, and as the wisest and truest leader of his race this country has ever produced. And so we see right away American newspaper publishers kind of adopt Washington as the spokesman for African Americans in the 1890s. It is a role he continued to play until the end of his life, but it was not without criticism, especially from other black leaders at the time. But Washington was the type of black leader that white America felt most comfortable with. And that is expressed, I think, in this article and in the reaction to the speech at the Atlanta Exposition. So if you have any questions or comments about Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition address, or about whether or not you think he should have remained silent, please post those comments or questions to the discussion board.